Hi, friends. Welcome again to another episode of Beyond the Clouds Edge to Edge Transformation. And speaking of transformation, we have Dr. Jeffrey Funk here with us. Jeffrey, tell us about your story. How did you end up in Japan, Singapore, and many countries in the Far East?
Well, I've been interested in technology my whole life. America landed on the moon when I was 13 years old, so I was obsessed with physics at the time. I thought that was the future of the world. And I watched Star Trek, and I majored in physics in school. I went to work for a semiconductor factory in the late 70s. Everyone was talking about energy and got involved with energy. I went back and became a professor. And during that time, I got very interested in Japan. I studied a lot of Japanese. In '89, I worked in a company in Japan. In the 90s, I took a Fulbright fellowship to work at a university in Japan. I decided to move there full time. And it happened to coincide with the start of the mobile internet services. This was a very big impact on me in terms of innovation, because I'd go to visit these companies and they would talk about how, well, the new phones are coming out, and so we're going to offer these kind of content services. So I learned a lot about how small changes in what was going inside the phones, the memory, the processors, the displays, had a big impact on what content was involved. And then I went to Singapore in 2007, where I began to teach a course on the economics of new technologies. And so a lot of my method came from looking at how mobile phones had succeeded. There was very little success of the Western mobile phone services until the iPhone came out in 2007. And as I was teaching it, I realized there wasn't a lot to update. The performance didn't get better. All these things like nanotechnology, people forecasting 15 years ago, bioelectronics, superconductors for energy, it wasn't happening. So I started to look also at startups, and I noticed that people called Uber service ride sharing, but no one was sharing a ride. It was the driver and the passenger. It wasn't ride sharing. And so I began to realize a lot of these services weren't as revolutionary as people were saying they were. As more information on the startup losses came out, it's because they weren't very revolutionary. You look back in the 70s and 80s, and you look at all the semiconductors that came out that were revolutionary. You look at the internet of the 1990s, it was revolutionary. A lot of what we've been seeing recently isn't revolutionary. Now, some people are going to say generative AI is revolutionary. Well, and it is more so than many of the things that happened in the previous 10 years. A lot of the positive things of mobile phones influenced me, but also a lot of the disappointments over the last 15 years influenced my thinking.
What about the fact that before the mobile phones, very few people had access to the internet? In the United States, we find that to be a big change. How about in Asia? Did you see that access has gone up because of mobile phones?
Everybody in the world has more access to the internet than they did 30 years ago. It's better personal computers, better connection, faster bandwidth, faster speeds, faster microprocessors on personal computers, mobile phones. All of this has contributed towards big increases in internet usage all over the world, and certainly in Asia. E-commerce, mobile commerce, that's old technology. That's from the 90s, that's from the 2000s, talking about since 2010. Really, since the iPad of 2010, there hasn't been a lot of new technologies succeeding anywhere near as did the iPad, the iPhone, the VR, the AR, the delivery drones, the blockchain. All of these are not doing anywhere near as well as technologies did 15 years ago.
Since you have been studying this for a long time and you've seen it internationally in multiple countries, Jeff, what would success look like to you?
We still see improvements in these types of things. The speeds of the internet for mobile and for personal computers, Wi-Fi and things are all increasing. All of that is getting better. It's the new stuff that isn't really coming online. The market sizes for these new technologies, VR, AR, and so on, they're not as big as if you look at what the market for personal computers was in 1990, what e-commerce was in 2000, what mobile phones were in 2000. So we're not seeing the changes in the new technologies that we saw 20 years ago.
How about the scene with electric vehicles and energy in general?
Electric vehicles is certainly one of the most successful of the new technologies. I think that last year, 14% of the sales in the world were from electric vehicles. OLEDs are doing well. Organic light emitting diode displays are doing well. Solar cells. But these aren't doing as well as what they replaced. I mean, if you look back at what internal combustion engines did versus 120 years ago, EVs don't have that big of impact. If you look at OLEDs, they have a big impact. They're great, but they don't have as big an impact as LCDs had 30 years ago. Those are the biggest success stories.
The way we are using up energy for even basic applications, I don't think there's enough energy in the world.
Well, there's enough oil in the world. It's just that people don't want to use it. There's enough nuclear power and things. It's just a matter of what choices we want to make.
I guess you grew up in the United States and you've been in the Eastern countries now for at least a couple of decades. Have you seen any changes in demographics in terms of conditions of living, technology, and so on?
Well, the whole world is aging, and some countries are aging faster than others. I mean, Japan, the population is declining. They just weren't having enough kids, and they weren't letting in enough immigrants, and they're letting a few more now, but not enough to fill the hole. The sad thing is then you see lots of cities that have lost lots of people, Nagasaki and things. And so housing prices have plummeted. There's empty houses everywhere. So back in the 80s, housing prices were skyrocketing. Now they're going down. In China, we see the same thing, not enough young people. I predict the same thing in Singapore.
What are the things that get you excited? You've been writing fairly regularly.
I have been interested in technology, faster productivity growth, faster income growth, better lives for people. But I find a lot of the discussions of the technology to be too broad, too vague. You have to be precise about how you think the technology is going to impact on the world. We see these broad pronouncements about how generative AI is going to change the world, put everybody out of work, and it's all vague. I just read a Harvard Business Review article. CEOs asking the author, when are we going to replace all these people? I grew up with these use cases. In personal computers, we had to use it for word processing. People were using it for spreadsheets. These were obvious use cases. When the e-commerce started, right away I could see, wow, you can get books. Man, I've had so much trouble finding these books, going to bookstores. Now I can just order them online. So I'm looking for those kinds of success stories that tell us something about the future. And with generative AI, I see some. I see the ability to make movies more effectively. For years, movie companies have used old cartoons, old animation to make new animation. A lot of the movements of the characters are the same, and they just kind of changed what they wear and things. Movie sequels that use previous footage from the first movies. Generative AI just merely helps that. You look at other applications in generative AI, what can it do? Well, there's a book industry, but it's pretty hard to think that we're going to replace all these book authors with generated AI. I look for these and I find people so focused on, I can do these tasks like email and write reports, but they're not thinking about the processes that are involved in the companies, because that's what we're trying to improve. We're not trying to improve individual tasks. We're trying to improve system productivity. We're trying to improve system processes. And that's the hard part, use cases that actually improve system productivity. That has to improve not only the productivity of the person sending the email, but improve the productivity of the person who has to read the mail. Think of all the activities that are involved in that process, and then see how we're going to use generative AI to improve. I'm very optimistic about generative AI being used in coding. The problem, again, is it's not individual productivity. It's a system productivity. A lot of people talked about hallucinations and problems with code. So even if those hallucinations, the percentage of those cases is small, like 1% or 0.1%, somebody has to fix those problems. We've known for decades that mistakes end up costing lots of money down the line. So we have to make sure that these mistakes don't happen. So we need a process that incorporates generative AI to develop code that then catches those mistakes before they're implemented or fixes them or something. So people have to think about this overall process. A lot of these very optimistic predictions have been made for the last 10 years. It isn't just suddenly generative AI emerged. I remember all of these waves of AI. I remember IBM Watson. I remember self-driving vehicles. I remember all the forecasts about radiology. I remember the forecast by Jeff Bezos and others for VR, AR, delivery drones, and so on. And we should be aware that in the last 10 years, we've had so many false positives. For some reason, there's this hype that just pours out right about this new technology. McKinsey made this prediction in 2015 that by 2030 we have 15 trillion in economic gains from AI. There's lots of people who are making much more sane predictions 15 years ago, 8 years ago. I'm not the first person to talk about this. Marianne Mazzucato's book, she's very critical of big consulting firms. It's very easy for companies to hype things up a lot. 20 years ago, the small number of news companies were very concerned with their reputation. Their reputation determined everything.
I'm still waiting for people to colonize Mars. There were such tall claims about colonizing Mars and exiting Earth.
Musk, he was talking about being on Mars by 2024. He was talking about self-driving vehicles driving across America by 2019. And certainly the tech bros, they have a very big optimistic message because they're selling these technologies. It's the greater fool theory. You can always find someone else, some bigger fool who's paid more money than you did. A lot of VCs made their money by selling on their investments to other people. So there's a lot of talk about how long can those VCs last? How long can these startups last? Privately owned unicorns are also losing money because they're not as good as the publicly owned unicorns. The publicly owned unicorns went public because they were doing better than the privately owned ones. A lot of people have talked, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times have talked about the reckoning that's going to happen in the next few months as some of these unicorns run out of money. When you look at the number of profitable startups at IPO time, it was higher back then than it is now. Most of them made money long before 10 years. Most startups from 20 to 50 years ago made money before they were 10 years old. Microsoft was before they were 5 years old. See, this is something new. The losses that have continued for years and years and years. And the fact that these startups have been allowed to become so big despite being loss-making. So during the dot-com bubble, the bubble burst and all these incumbents, Cisco, all their share prices went way down. That's what caused most of the NASDAQ bubble to burst. There were startups and a lot of them went bankrupt. But see, those startups weren't big. Now we're looking at big startups that are still losing money. It's a very different bubble now in which we've allowed it to go on for so many more years than the dot-com bubble went on. And why that is probably has to do with the amount of stimulus spending that governments around the world flooded the market, huge amounts of funding. It's very different from the dot-com bubble. In addition, during the dot-com bubble, we had e-commerce market growing. And now we look at, well, what's the new things? VR, AR, delivery, drones, blockchain. The markets aren't growing. A lot of people in the tech industry don't want to hear this kind of argument because their jobs are dependent on it. They're hoping that the ARM IPO will do well, the Instacart IPO will do well, so that all of these other privately held unicorns can go public. Instacart's actually profitable. But even then, its valuation has been cut by 3/4. It's not going to be 40 billion like people thought it was going to be a few years ago. ARM people are not talking about it doing as well. I don't think this is going to allow the number of IPOs to increase. There's a lot of interest in AI companies, but the problem is that there isn't a lot of AI startups that have lots of revenues, much less profits, other than OpenAI. Most of the AI companies with big revenues are these big incumbents, Google, Microsoft, and Meta companies that are doing very well. These bubbles are driven by a lot of things. Investors are saying to companies, if you're not big on AI, then we're not going to give you a high share price because we think that's the future. And so even if companies think we're going to take it slowly, they have to talk big. This is how bubbles work. I have a book coming out called Competing in the Age of Bubbles, early in 2024 from Harriman House. It's about these micro bubbles. So this is another thing that's very different. The dot-com bubble was really one narrative about how the internet was going to change everything. But now we're looking at lots of micro bubbles. We're looking at lots of narratives. There is some commonality among the narratives, this optimism about the future and about technology. But they're about different markets. There's different narratives for generative AI, for EVTOLs, for nuclear fusion, for quantum computing. So there's these micro bubbles, each with a slightly different narrative.
I'm glad, Jeff, you're speaking your truth. It's much more comfortable to say what a hype cycle is saying. So thank you for being direct and honest about it. What do you think people should do under the circumstances from a career perspective or from their financial portfolio perspective?
What are young people going to do? They have to go into some kind of tech. It's the only choice. I have a 10-year-old son. He's learning computers, programming robots. I encourage that. I encourage biology. DNA sequencing, gene editing, all of this. Young people have to study this, but don't get so excited about a lot of the hype, and certainly don't try to become a prompt engineer. Think longer term about understanding technology. From an investor standpoint, I think that you have to be very careful. There certainly will be firms that benefit from AI, but I don't think the ultimate winners are really known now. I think that generative AI is going to have its impact on productivity through companies training their internal systems on their internal data. I don't think that it's going to be so easy as, oh, they're just going to use Chat GPT and improve productivity. No, it won't be so simple. So it'll be more complex than that. So if you're very careful and following what the uses are, you can do well as an investor.
Something gives me hope that just like we've seen productivity in other areas, maybe there will be productivity coming out of this new way of synthesizing information and going from unstructured data to a new set of unstructured data. Do you see that there is a possibility that things will get better over time?
And there's a lot of possibilities. You just have to be open-minded and not get excited about every small thing that's happening.
Jeff, first of all, thank you for making the time to talk early mornings. I'm truly grateful. Second, I would love to see your book when it comes in print. So share any kind of information on it. I'm waiting to actually see your book. Not too many people are facing realities. Again, to people out there, I'm always looking for divergent views because nobody has a compass on what the future will be like. So thanks again, Jeff, and let's see where we are going from here.
Thank you.